Welcome to Geekstorians, the show that digs into the industrial decisions, cultural pivots, and stranger-than-fiction stories behind the things we love. I'm Dave from Geektown. Season 3 of Geekstorians is called The Conquest. It's the story of how geek culture went from the margins to the machine, and what happened once it arrived. Because conquest is not the end of the story. It's the awkward bit after. What happens when the strange little obsessions that fans carried around like secret maps suddenly become valuable enough for boardrooms to notice? This episode is about one of the most dramatic examples of that shift. It begins with a filmmaker in a Wellington shed who refused to accept the word unfilmable. It ends with the chapters he chose to skip being treated as prime franchise real estate. Because once Middle-earth became a cinematic triumph, it also became something else. A machine with licensing agreements. This is Middle-earth, Inc. Los Angeles, February 1998. A meeting room somewhere inside the New Line Cinema offices. A filmmaker has just flown in from New Zealand. He has a pitch. He has concept art. He has 35 seconds of test footage shot in his own back garden with a borrowed camera and some friends in costume. Which is not usually how you convince Hollywood to hand you hundreds of millions of dollars. Usually they prefer something more reassuring, like a proven track record or a bankable star, or at least the general sense that you haven't arrived with a fantasy epic held together by hope, nerve, and a very intense relationship with miniatures. The studio he was counting on had said no. The studio before that said it was unfilmable. Several others haven't called back, which in Hollywood is the polite version of sealing someone in a tomb. Peter Jackson has 2 weeks to sell The Lord of the Rings or the project dies. Across the table is Bob Shaye, co-founder of New Line Cinemas. But there's something about Bob Shaye that Jackson doesn't know yet. Shaye has actually read the book. All of it. The Fellowship, The Two Towers, The Return of the King. He read it in the 1960s as a student, when Tolkien was circulating through American universities alongside folk music, counterculture politics, and the kind of paperback that looked like it had already survived 3 owners and one suspicious stain. Back then, Lord of the Rings wasn't a franchise. It wasn't a content universe. It was just a book somebody pressed into your hand and said, "You need to read this." So Shaye looks at the art. He watches the footage, all 35 seconds of it. And then he asks the question nobody else had asked. Not, is this financeable? Not, can we get a toy line out of it? Not even, Peter, are you absolutely sure you want to spend the next 7 years of your life surrounded by mud, prosthetics, and increasingly distressed accountants? He just asks, why 2 films? The story is 3 books. Why not make 3? Jackson stares at him, because nobody has given him that option, not once. Up until this point, the negotiation had been about survival. How much can be cut? How much can be compressed? How much story can be removed before The Lord of the Rings technically still counts as Lord of the Rings? Shaye is asking the opposite question. What if the problem isn't that Jackson is asking for too much? What if he hasn't asked for enough? New Line will finance 3 Lord of the Rings films, simultaneously, shot back-to-back in New Zealand, with a budget that will eventually approach $300 million. It is one of the most ambitious gambles in studio history. Nobody at New Line is completely sure it's going to work, and neither is Jackson. But Bob Shaye has read the book, and that, it turns out, is going to make all the difference. Let's go back slightly further. Before New Line, before all the Oscars, before half the world decided they could identify New Zealand mountain ranges by emotional trauma alone. There was a much simpler belief about The Lord of the Rings. You couldn't film it, not properly. People had tried, sort of. In 1977, Rankin Bass had made an animated television version of The Hobbit for NBC. Warmer, stranger, more child-friendly. A version of Tolkien that could fit inside a TV special, provided you sanded down enough edges and accepted that Middle-earth now looks slightly like it had been built for Saturday morning children with cereal bowls. It worked up to a point. You could do Tolkien, particularly The Hobbit, as a children's adventure. You could do Bilbo, dwarves, songs, riddles, goblins, barrels, and one very annoyed dragon. But The Lord of the Rings was another problem entirely. A year later, Ralph Bakshi released an animated version of The Lord of the Rings. It covered the first half of the story, roughly the Fellowship and part of the Two Towers, and then it simply stopped. The second half was never made. The film underperformed, the studio passed, the story was left hanging on a freeze frame without resolution, which is a bold artistic choice if you mean it, and a slightly awkward one if you've just run out of money. That was the state of Tolkien adaptations for most of cinema history. You could do a children's version, you could do a fragment, you could gesture vaguely towards the mountain, but the whole thing? The actual Lord of the Rings? No. The prevailing wisdom entering the 1990s was that Tolkien was unfilmable. Not because the books weren't beloved, they were enormously beloved. That was part of the problem. The Lord of the Rings wasn't just a plot, it was languages, maps, songs, bloodlines, old grief, older trees, ancient kings, minor characters with more backstory than most franchises give their leads, and an entire fictional history pressed down on every page like geological weight. Readers carried that history in their heads. They had lived it, reread it, argued over it, mentally pronounced names incorrectly for decades and become emotionally attached to those wrong pronunciations. How do you put that on screen without turning it into a glorified greatest hits package? Hollywood looked at all of that and did what Hollywood often does when faced with a beloved complex literary object. It backed slowly out of the room. For 20 years, that was considered prudence. And then Peter Jackson decided everybody was wrong. By 1995, Jackson was not the obvious choice to film Tolkien, which is putting it gently. His early career included Bad Taste, a micro-budget alien invasion comedy shot over 4 years with friends, weekends, and the kind of resourcefulness that suggests health and safety had simply chosen not to be involved. Then came Braindead, known as Dead Alive in North America, a zombie horror film that appears to have been made by asking, what if a fire hose could shoot blood? And then Heavenly Creatures, a dramatic reconstruction of a real 1950s murder case, which earned Kate Winslet her first major recognition and got Jackson into the Cannes Film Festival. So yes, there was talent, there was imagination, there was craft, but there was not, on paper, much to suggest this was the person you hand one of the most expensive franchise productions in cinema history. He had no experience with large-scale action, no experience with studio fantasy, no experience with the kind of industrial machinery required to coordinate armies, landscapes, miniatures, effects houses, prosthetics, logistics, and actors spending years of their lives pretending not to be cold in cloaks. He had instead something more useful though, a complete inability to believe the project was impossible. Jackson had been a Tolkien fan since childhood. He first read The Lord of the Rings as a teenager, which is usually the exact age when Tolkien either passes you by or completely rewires part of your brain forever. He wasn't approaching the material academically. He wasn't approaching it as a brand. He was approaching it in the way a fan approaches something they love, with terrifying clarity, unreasonable commitment, and the absolute certainty that everyone else had been imagining it slightly wrong. Which frankly is how half of geek culture gets built. In 1995, he called his producers and said, let's do it. The film rights to The Lord of the Rings were controlled by Sol Zantz, who had acquired them from Tolkien decades earlier for the Bakshi animated film and still held them. Jackson and his team spent years trying to prise them loose. Eventually, Miramax got involved. The company secured the rights direct from Zantz and began developing Jackson's version of the project. Not 3 films, 2. That was already a compromise. Jackson wanted to do Tolkien properly as 3, but 2 films felt like the version Hollywood might actually survive hearing out loud. So the work began. Scripts, concept art, early designs, test footage. The long, expensive process of turning an impossible idea into something a studio might be brave, foolish, or legally cornered enough into green lighting. But as the scale became clear, Miramax panicked. They said 2 films were too expensive. Make it 1. 1 film for Lord of the Rings. Which is like adapting the Bible as a pamphlet and hoping nobody notices the missing bits. And this is where the real disagreement begins. Because the argument was not simply about length, it was about what Lord of the Rings was. To Miramax, it was a fantasy property that needed compression, a long book that could be reduced, a risk that had to be managed down until it looked less terrifying on a spreadsheet. To Jackson, it was 3 connected volumes forming 1 story. Not material to be mined, but a structure to be respected. There's a difference between adapting a story because you understand its shape and processing an asset because you've paid for it. By the late 1990s, Jackson and Miramax hit an impasse. The project had reached a wall with neither side sure how to get around it. Miramax agreed to let Jackson shop it around, but only briefly. Another studio would have to repay Miramax's development costs and take on the risk. If nobody bit, Miramax kept the project, and the 1 film version, or no version at all, would be the end of it. Jackson's agent spent Friday afternoon calling every major studio in Hollywood. By Monday morning, everyone had passed, except Bob Shaye, because Bob Shaye had read the book. What happened next took 6 years, which is a very calm sentence for something that was, in practice, absolute logistical madness wearing a cloak. Filming began in October 1999. All 3 films shot simultaneously across New Zealand with a principal photography schedule lasting 15 months. So not 1 film first and everyone checking to see whether it worked, 3 films all at once. Which is less like normal filmmaking and more like deciding to build a cathedral, a castle, and a functioning medieval economy because someone in accounting briefly looked away. The cast and crew eventually approached around 1,000 people. Locations sprawled across the country. Costumes, weapons, props, prosthetics, miniatures, sets, creatures, languages, maps, banners, armor, all of it had to exist. Not theoretically or in a lore document, on camera, in mud, in weather, usually while someone was wearing ears or hairy feet. None of it existed before Jackson and his team built it. Weta Workshop, Jackson's practical effects company, had existed since the late 1980s as a small Wellington-based operation. Lord of the Rings turned it into one of the most sophisticated design and fabrication houses in the world. Under creative supervisor Richard Taylor, Weta became a kind of fantasy industrial organism. One department was forging armor, another was sculpting orc faces. Somewhere else, people were aging swords, distressing leather, building helmets, painting shields, and creating props for cultures that didn't technically exist but absolutely had strong opinions about metalwork. And then there were the miniatures. Except miniatures is not quite right. Some of them were so enormous, the crew actually called them bigatures, which sounds like a word invented by a tired production coordinator at 3 a.m. and then somehow accepted into cinema history, which it was. Whoa. These were vast models of places like Rivendell, Helm's Deep, and Minas Tirith. Not little tabletop toys, huge detailed constructions filmed with motion-controlled cameras so the impossible could feel physical. That was Weta's approach in miniature, or bigature. Build the thing, weather the thing, light the thing, and then let the camera believe in it. And then there was the chainmail. Traditionally, screen chainmail had often been a cheat. Silver-painted wool, knitted armor, the sort of thing that worked perfectly well from a distance providing nobody got too close, moved too quickly, or asked why the brave knight appeared to be wearing a metallic cardigan. But Middle-earth needed something better. It needed armor that caught the light like metal, moved like metal, and still allowed the actors to run, fight, fall over, get back up, and do it all again without turning into exhausted cutlery. So Weta made fake chainmail from plastic rings. Millions of them. Cut from sheets, linked together by hand, painted to look like steel. Somewhere in Wellington, at the turn of the millennium, a human being spent an alarming amount of professional time cutting tiny plastic rings so that 20 years later, people on the internet could say, "See, this is why it looks better." And the annoying thing is, they're right. That specificity is important because it tells you what kind of production this was. The Lord of the Rings was not built on the idea that technology could save you from doing the work. It was built on the opposite assumption. Do the work first, then use technology to extend and polish it. If you could build something, build it. If you could put an actor in a real location, do it. If you could make a sword, make a sword. If you could send a man into a field wearing several kilograms of prosthetics and a face full of latex, well, apparently that was also on the table. The camera would know the difference. And even if the audience couldn't explain why, they would feel it. That's the crucial distinction. These films were not anti-digital, they were full of digital work, but the digital effects were anchored to a physical world that felt touched, battered, weathered, lived in. Middle-earth didn't look like a screensaver with actors composited into it. It looked like somewhere that had mud and taxes and deeply impractical municipal planning. And while all of this was happening, the scripts were still alive. Not unfinished in the sense of nobody knows what happens at the end, Tolkien had mercifully handled that, but alive in the way enormous films are alive. Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens were constantly reviving, reshaping, cutting, compressing, and finding cinematic equivalents for things that work beautifully on the page but would stop a film dead if treated too literally. Shooting all three films together didn't mean the trilogy was locked. It meant every decision echoed across everything. Cut something from Fellowship and suddenly Two Towers had to absorb the pressure. Change a character's emphasis and Return of the King had to pay it off. Move one emotional beat and a couple of films later the entire structure could wobble like a table with one leg slightly shorter than the other. This should have been disastrous. A trilogy being rewritten whilst it's being built is not normally a sign of stable industrial health. It's usually the point where someone from the studio starts using phrases like concerned but exciting while quietly updating their CV. But what saved it in large part was the source material. Tolkien had already done the deep work. The world existed, the geography, the languages, the history, the internal logic, the old grief buried under every hill and ruined statue. It was already there. Jackson's job was not to invent Middle-earth, it was to translate it. To decide consistently and under pressure what each page became when it stopped being prose and started being cinema. That's not a small job. That's a job made almost entirely of impossible compromises. What do you cut? What do you keep? What can be implied by a glance? What absolutely cannot be explained because the film is already 3 hours long and people occasionally need to use the toilet? The miracle is not that Jackson changed things. Of course he changed things. Adaptation is change. The miracle is that the changes mostly feel like they belong to the same organism. And then there was Gollum. Gollum is the test case for what this production achieved, because Gollum should not work. Not in 2001, not at that emotional level. The problem is that he is neither wholly human nor wholly creature. He is a corrupted hobbit, centuries old, degraded by the weight of the ring, ruined by desire and still somehow recognizable underneath it. He needs to be pathetic and threatening at the same time, funny and horrifying, pitiful and skin-crawling, a goblin made of need. Which is an incredibly difficult thing to put on screen without accidentally creating either a cartoon gremlin or a damp theatre student with posture issues. CGI at the time was improving quickly, but digital characters still often felt separate from the world around them, inserted and weightless, technically impressive but emotionally sealed behind glass. They could move, they could snarl, they could fall off things very convincingly, but they struggled with thought, with shame, with wanting something and hating yourself for wanting it. Andy Serkis changed that. He was cast as Gollum, and he did something the production had not initially planned around. He performed the role physically on set with the other actors, not as a vague reference or as somebody crouching nearby before the real work happened later. As the performance, Serkis gave the other actors something to react to. He gave the animators something human to translate. The voice, the body, the eyes, the twitching need, the horrible little flashes of wounded intelligence, all of that became the foundation of what Weta Digital built. And that's why Gollum lands. He's not a special effect with acting pasted onto it. He's an acting performance carried through CGI. That sounds like a technical distinction, but it isn't. It's the difference between watching a creature and watching a person trapped inside one. Gollum could be frightening, he could be in pain, he could be funny in a way that made you immediately feel bad for laughing. He could look at the ring with the expression of someone seeing salvation, addiction, memory, and doom all arriving in the same terrible little circle. That was new, not because the camera had never used digital characters before, but because this one felt psychologically alive. Jackson, Serkis, and Weta had not just solved a production problem, they'd opened a door. And once Hollywood saw that door open, it was never going to stop walking through it. Because this is the awkward truth sitting underneath the triumph. The Lord of the Rings worked because craft, technology, obsession, and story all pulled in the same direction. It was a machine, yes, but it was a machine built to serve the myth. Later that relationship would start to reverse. But for now though, it worked. Almost impossibly well. The Fellowship of the Ring opened on December 19th, 2001, and this was the moment everyone found out whether Peter Jackson had pulled off the impossible or simply spent several years and a terrifying amount of money proving why nobody else had tried. He had pulled it off. The film was a critical and commercial success. It made more than $870 million worldwide, but the money was only part of the story. What mattered was the tone. Critics who had expected a bloated fantasy spectacle found something careful, serious, and emotionally direct. A film that didn't smirk at the mythology. It didn't apologize for the songs and swords and elves. It didn't treat the audience like they were needing to be reassured every 12 minutes that this wasn't all terribly silly. It trusted the world. And because it trusted the world, the audience did too. The Two Towers followed in December 2002. And by then, something had shifted. The question was no longer, can this work? It was, how big can this get? Helm's Deep became one of the great modern action sequences. Not just because it was enormous, although it absolutely was, and it seemed to be designed to answer the question, what if rain could have plot momentum? It worked because the spectacle had emotional geography. You understood where these people were. You understood what was at stake. You understood why a wall mattered, why a door mattered, why one exhausted king looking at a hopeless battlefield mattered. It was scale with purpose. Then on December 17th, 2003, came Return of the King. And I do want to linger here for a moment because the Academy Awards ceremony on February 29th, 2004 is where Lord of the Rings stopped being merely successful and became historically inconvenient. The Return of the King was nominated in 11 categories, which for a fantasy film is already astonishing. This is a film with orcs, ghosts, giant spiders, flaming eyeballs, and several hours of people looking meaningfully at jewelry. Not usually the Academy's natural habitat. But then it won. Everything. 11 nominations, 11 wins. Best Picture, Best Director, Best Adapted Screenplay, Visual Effects, Score, Editing, Costumes, Art Direction, Sound, Song, the lot. No polite, well done for the technical categories. No consolation pat on the head for doing very impressive things with armor. Return of the King tied the all-time Oscar record alongside Ben-Hur and Titanic and became the first film to win 11 from 11. That's not just a statistic. That's a cultural door being kicked open by a hobbit. Fantasy had spent decades being treated as category entertainment, genre fare, escapism. Profitable, certainly. Beloved, absolutely. But still kept slightly away from the grown-up table, in case it started talking about wizards during the serious courses. The closest fantasy had come to that level of Academy recognition was Star Wars, which won technical awards in 1978 but lost Best Picture to Annie Hall, which is either a perfectly reasonable decision or a crime still being litigated in certain households depending on the household. But The Return of the King standing on stage at the Kodak Theatre with 11 Oscars meant something very specific. It meant the Academy, not an organisation historically famous for sprinting towards the strange, had looked at a 3-film fantasy epic adapted from Tolkien, shot in New Zealand by a man who made Braindead, and said, yes, this is the best film of the year. Fantasy was legitimate. And Hollywood was watching. That's the dangerous bit. Because the lesson Hollywood could have taken from Lord of the Rings was, if you understand the material, respect the shape of the story, build the world with conviction and commit completely, audiences will follow you anywhere. That would have been a good lesson, a useful lesson. A lesson involving craft, patience, risk, and the terrifying possibility that the geeks were right. But Hollywood often hears lessons through several layers of accounting documents. So the version they heard was closer to large fantasy property plus massive scale equals global money. Which is not wrong, it's just missing several important words in the middle. Jackson had proved the unfilmable could be filmed. He had built a world-class effects house from a Wellington workshop. He'd made 3 films simultaneously on a combined budget that by modern blockbuster standards now looks almost suspiciously sensible. He'd turned a literary landmark Hollywood had avoided for decades into one of the most celebrated film trilogies ever made. He'd done exactly what he set out to do. And then he was done. As far as Jackson was concerned, the story of Middle-earth had been told. Not all of Tolkien, obviously. Not every appendix, not every poem, footnote, geological aside, walking song or mysterious man in yellow boots, but the story he had come to tell. The one with Frodo, the ring, and the road to Mordor. That was finished. The machine, however, had learnt a different lesson. And the machine was not finished at all. The Hobbit was always the next obvious step, because of course it was. In publication terms, Tolkien wrote it first, and narratively it happens earlier. So in Hollywood terms, it's now a prequel. Bilbo Baggins, the dwarves, the Lonely Mountain, Smaug, and the Ring, before anybody fully understands what the Ring is. It's the doorway into Middle-earth. It is also, and this becomes important, a single book. A short one. Shorter than any of the 3 volumes that make up Lord of the Rings. Around 300 pages, depending on the edition. A children's adventure story, lighter in tone, more episodic in shape, full of songs, riddles, trolls, goblins, spiders, barrels, and one extremely irritated dragon. By any reasonable cinematic reckoning, it is a story you could tell in 1 film. Possibly 2 if you wanted room to breathe. Which in Hollywood terms meant the warning lights were already beginning to blink, because after The Lord of the Rings, Middle-earth was no longer just a literary world. It was infrastructure. Weta existed, the audience existed, the market existed, the expectation existed. And expectations, once they get expensive enough, start behaving less like hope and more like obligation. Peter Jackson was not initially going to direct The Hobbit. The plan, developed around 2006, was for Guillermo del Toro to take it on. And on paper, that made sense. Del Toro had the kind of imagination for it. He understood monsters, he understood fairy tales, he understood that grotesque things can be tragic, funny, beautiful, and deeply unsettling, sometimes all before breakfast. So he moved to New Zealand. He spent 2 years in deep pre-production. Designs were built, sequences planned. Weta teams were working. The machine was warming up again, this time under a different hand. And then MGM went bankrupt. Which is not usually what you want in the middle of a fantasy adventure, unless the fantasy adventure is about distribution rights, legal paralysis, and several rooms full of lawyers slowly draining the soul of everybody involved. MGM had partial distribution rights to The Hobbit, and its financial collapse in 2010 threw the production into uncertainty for more than a year. Del Toro had already given 2 years of his career to a film that had not yet properly started, and eventually he made the entirely reasonable decision to leave. He had other films he could make. He couldn't keep waiting around in Middle-earth while the real dragon turned out to be corporate insolvency. So Peter Jackson stepped in. Not as the returning conquering hero exactly. More like the person who built the house being asked in an emergency to come back because the extension had become structurally alarming. By his own later admission, this was not the ideal situation. Jackson agreed to direct a film he was not fully prepared to direct, on a compressed timeline without the years of preparation he had on the original trilogy. And that contrast is important. Lord of the Rings had been terrifyingly ambitious, yes, but it had also been deeply prepared. Years of development, design work, script work, world building. The madness was real, but it was organized madness. The Hobbit was different. It inherited the machinery of Middle-earth, but not the same conditions that had made the first trilogy work. And then came the decision that has defined those films ever since. 2 films became 3. The announcement came in July 2012, after filming had already begun. A 300-page children's novel, originally developed as 2 films, originally under another director, was now going to become a 3-film epic. And the studio logic is not hard to understand. The 3 Lord of the Rings films had each earned around $1 billion globally. A 3rd Hobbit film meant a 3rd theatrical release, a 3rd marketing campaign, a 3rd home entertainment cycle, a 3rd set of ancillary revenue streams. Commercially, it made sense. But that is the problem. Because 3 Hobbit films made commercial sense in almost exactly the way 3 Lord of the Rings films made creative sense. The original trilogy needed 3 films because the story demanded that shape. The Hobbit became 3 films because the opportunity could bear the weight, or at least that was the hope. An Unexpected Journey opened in December 2012. Its running time was 2 hours 49 minutes, which is a long time to spend on the beginning of a short book. The film covers Bilbo leaving the Shire and joining the dwarves on the road towards the Lonely Mountain. In the source material, that's roughly the opening stretch of the novel, a brisk adventure, a fairy tale journey gathering momentum. On screen, it becomes something heavier. The film supplements Tolkien's text with material from the Lord of the Rings appendices. Foreshadowing, expanded mythology, connective tissue, returning characters, invented subplots, and a growing sense that the story is no longer simply being adapted, it's being inflated. Some of that expansion makes sense. The appendices do contain important background material. The rise of Sauron, the White Council, Gandalf's movements elsewhere, the darker historical machinery behind the lighter adventure. There is a version of The Hobbit that uses that material elegantly, giving the story a shadow it didn't fully have on the page. But there's also a version where the shadow starts to eat the story. And that is what happens too often. The Hobbit as a book is about Bilbo, a small person leaving home and discovering he is braver, cleverer, and stranger than anyone, including himself, expected. But the films kept dragging his story towards the gravitational pull of the Lord of the Rings. The Necromancer, the Ring, the return of Old Evil, the machinery of franchise continuity. Suddenly Bilbo's adventure is not allowed to be simply Bilbo's adventure. It has to become a prelude, a bridge, a brand-consistent corridor leading back to the trilogy everyone already loves. And you can feel the strain. Then there are invented elements. Tauriel, the elven warrior created for the films, appears nowhere in Tolkien. In principle, that's not automatically a problem. Adaptations invent things all the time. The Lord of the Rings films invented, compressed, and rearranged plenty. The issue is not invention. The issue is whether the invention feels like it's grown from the story, or whether it feels like the story has been opened up to install extra components. With The Hobbit, too many additions felt structural rather than organic. More conflict, more villains, more action, more links to the other films, more material to justify the running time. More, in other words, because more was now the business model. Jackson later acknowledged the production had not been managed ideally. He talks about starting without the preparation time needed. He describes days where they were improvising under pressure. He describes not always having the scripts properly worked out before they were shooting, which is an extraordinary admission when you consider the contrast. The Lord of the Rings had been a huge creative risk, but it did have years of groundwork beneath it. The Hobbit had a returning director, a massive built-in audience, an established production base, and the full weight of one of cinema's most beloved trilogies behind it. On paper, it looked safer. In practice, it was wobblier, because safety is not the same as readiness. And infrastructure is not the same as purpose, and you can see the difference on screen. The original trilogy used digital effects constantly, but they were usually anchored in physical texture. The Hobbit leans far more heavily into digital environments and digital creatures, and sometimes the image starts to float away from itself. Not always. There are beautiful shots. There are scenes with real craft. There are performances that work, especially Martin Freeman as Bilbo, who often seems to understand the exact film The Hobbit wants to be, even when the film around him is busy becoming 3 other films in a very expensive coat. But too often the world feels smoother, cleaner, less touched, less lived in. The original trilogy felt like an ancient place captured by camera. The Hobbit sometimes feels like a camera pointed at a very advanced rendering decision. And then there was the frame rate. Jackson shot The Hobbit at 48 frames per second, double the traditional cinema standard. The intention was understandable. Clarity, immersion, smooth emotion, a new technical frontier. Unfortunately for many viewers, the result didn't feel more cinematic, it felt more exposed. The higher frame rate made everything sharper, which sounds good until you remember that cinema often survives by not letting you see everything quite so clearly. Prosthetics looked like prosthetics. Sets looked more like sets. Artifice, which films usually soften into magic, suddenly had nowhere to hide. It was like somebody turned the lights on in a haunted house. Technically impressive, spiritually very unhelpful. The 3 Hobbit films made approximately $2.9 billion worldwide, so commercially they worked. The machine recovered its investment. Everyone got to say the word successful in meetings, which is one of Hollywood's favourite ways of avoiding a more interesting conversation. Yay! But culturally, something had changed. The audience could feel the stretch, the extra weight, the sense of a story being pulled beyond its natural shape because the infrastructure around it needed feeding. That doesn't mean that nobody cared. It doesn't mean that there was no craft on screen. The Lord of the Rings felt like cinema trying to honour a myth. The Hobbit often felt like a myth trying to survive cinema's business model. The original trilogy had expanded to fit the story. The Hobbit expanded to fit the opportunity. And once that became possible, once Middle-earth is no longer just a story but a production pipeline, the question changes. It stops being what needs to be told and becomes what else can we use? In November 2017, Amazon announced it had bought the global television rights to The Lord of the Rings. The reported price was around $250 million for the rights. Not for a finished show, not for sets, scripts, costumes, actors, visual effects, or a single beautifully lit elf staring into the middle distance as though remembering something expensive. Just the rights to start. That's a scale shift. Peter Jackson had gone to Hollywood with concept art, test footage, and an unreasonable belief that Tolkien should be filmed. Amazon arrived with a check large enough to make the dwarves of Erebor sit up and take notes. What Amazon was buying was not simply a story, it was association, cultural gravity, the emotional residue of a world that millions of people already loved. Because by this point, Middle-earth was not just a setting, it was a platform strategy. The result was The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, a series set thousands of years before Frodo, Bilbo, the Fellowship, and most of the faces audiences knew from Jackson's films. Which is on one level a perfectly reasonable creative decision. Tolkien's Second Age had scale, Sauron, Numenor, the forging of the rings, the long shadow before the story most people know. There is material there. But the challenge was obvious from the start. Amazon paid for The Lord of the Rings while making a series that could not be directly The Lord of the Rings. It had bought the house, but not all the furniture. So the show had to feel familiar without simply replaying the familiar. It had to honour Tolkien while also functioning as a long-running streaming drama, which means mysteries, cliffhangers, character arcs, season finales, renewal windows, and the cold mathematical knowledge that someone somewhere is checking completion rates. That's the difference between a story and a service. A story wants to end. A service would very much prefer that you continue watching after the credits. The first season reportedly cost hundreds of millions of dollars, making it one of the most expensive television productions ever mounted. It premiered in September 2022 and delivered the biggest launch in Prime Video history. So commercially, again, the machine worked. People came, the gates opened, the map lit up. But the response was not simple. Critics praised the scale, the design, the images, the sheer audacity of putting that much money on screen and asking television to look like a blockbuster every week. But there were also reservations about the writing, the pacing, the sense that this enormous world sometimes moved like something still waiting to discover its own dramatic engine. And then there was the fan reaction. Some of it was legitimate criticism, some of it was thoughtful. Some of it was viewers asking fair questions about adaptation, tone, structure, and whether the show had mistaken looking expensive for feeling mythic. And some of it was the internet doing what the internet does when it sees a diverse cast in a fantasy world and deciding the real enemy is not Sauron but apparently melatonin, which says considerably more about certain corners of online fandom than it does about Tolkien. Season 2 arrived in 2024. The conversation narrowed. The launch was still large by any ordinary television measure, but no longer had the shockwave of Season 1. That's the problem with buying cultural gravity. You get one first impact. After that, you need the story to keep people there. Season 3 is due in November 2026. The machine keeps running. Not because the argument has been settled, or everyone agrees that this is the definitive version of Middle-earth. Because the rights exist, the infrastructure exists, the investment exists. And streaming platforms do not spend that kind of money in order to quietly wander off after a mixed reception and a few thousand Reddit threads having an emotional breakdown in Elvish. Meanwhile, over at Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema, the theatrical machine had been started up again. Because cinema remembers what Middle-earth did. So now, there is Lord of the Rings: The Hunt for Gollum. Directed by Andy Serkis, produced by Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens. A return to the world Jackson built, but from the margins of the story rather than the centre. And that's important because The Hunt for Gollum is not adapting a new Tolkien novel. There's no secret fourth volume sitting in a drawer marked "break glass in case of shareholder anxiety." The film is being built from the spaces around the story, from appendices, from implication, from the gap between The Hobbit and the Fellowship of the Ring. Gollum has lost the ring. The ring has passed into the quiet possession of Bilbo Baggins. Gandalf begins to expect that the small, odd trinket in the Shire may be something far worse. Aragorn and the Rangers search for Gollum before the enemy can find him. In the books, much of this exists as backstory, the machinery behind the narrative rather than narrative itself, which makes it exactly the kind of territory modern franchise storytelling loves, because once the central story has been told, the gaps become real estate. The offhand reference becomes a pitch. The appendix becomes a treatment. A sentence that once existed to deepen the world becomes eventually a 3-act structure with a release date. But to be fair, if anyone understands Gollum as a screen character, it's Andy Serkis. His performance was one of the miracles of the original trilogy. He helped prove that digital characters could carry psychological weight. There is a potentially fascinating film inside Gollum. Obsession, addiction, memory, degradation. The horror of surviving too long with the worst parts of yourself still talking. That could work. It might be great. But structurally, its existence tells us something. We're no longer adapting the mountain. We're quarrying the foothills. And then there's the Stranger Project, the one that sounds at first like someone lost a bet at Comic-Con. Stephen Colbert is writing a Lord of the Rings film. Yes, that's Stephen Colbert. He's co-writing it with Philippa Boyens and Peter McGee, the former host of The Late Show who now finds he has some time to spare. Professional American satirist, occasional political flamethrower, and, crucially, one of the most public Tolkien obsessives on the planet. Colbert's Tolkien knowledge is not celebrity trivia night deep. It's alarming. This is a man who has publicly out-quizzed cast members, corrected people on law, and radiated the specific energy of someone who does not merely love the Silmarillion, but might, under pressure, attempt to defend the publication history of its appendices at dinner, which is both ridiculous and honestly quite reassuring. Because if the machine is going to return to parts of Tolkien that Jackson cut, there are worse people to send into the forest than a man who has clearly been emotionally resident there for decades. The project is reportedly called The Lord of the Rings: Shadow of the Past. And the really interesting detail is it's not simply that Colbert is involved. It's what the film appears to be circling. The early chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring that Jackson left out. The Old Forest, the Barrow Downs, Tom Bombadil. And if you've never read the book, Tom Bombadil is difficult to explain without sounding like you've suffered a mild blow to the head. He is a singing, yellow-booted, immensely powerful woodland figure who rescues the hobbits, ignores the ring's power, speaks in riddles, and then exits the narrative having apparently wandered in from a much older, weirder, and less plot-driven universe. For readers, Bombadil is fascinating. For filmmakers, he is a large, cheerful traffic cone placed in the middle of Act 1, so Jackson cut him. Correctly. Not because Bombadil is bad, but because the Fellowship of the Ring as a film needed forward motion. Although Tom Bombadil has technically already made it to screen. In Season 2 of The Rings of Power, he appeared, played by Rory Kinnear, which for decades of Tolkien fans was a strange little historical moment. The man Jackson cut out because he would have stopped the Fellowship of the Ring dead in its tracks, finally wandered into live action through Amazon's side door, singing his way into the Second Age like a cheerfully bearded reminder that some Tolkien characters don't so much fit into continuity as sit beside it eating bread and refusing to explain themselves. But the machinery had already started doing its thing. It had already begun reclaiming the material Jackson left out. The bits that were too strange, too still, or too structurally inconvenient for the original films. That doesn't make it automatically bad. Rory Kinnear is a superb actor. Bombadil is fascinating. And if any fantasy world can survive a mysterious ancient woodland man turning up to speak in riddles, it's probably this one. But editorially, it changes the point. Tom Bombadil is no longer the untouched thing. He is the proof of concept. The question is how much of the negative space around Lord of the Rings can now be turned into story. And this is where Middle-earth Inc. reaches its purest form. Not with a bad project or necessarily with a cynical one, but with the machine looking at a negative space around a masterpiece and asking, can we build there? Because once a world becomes valuable enough, nothing stays outside the map forever. Not the appendices, not the backstory, not the gaps, not even the man in the yellow boots. Let me be careful about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying these new projects are automatically bad. The Hunt for Gollum might be excellent. Shadow of the Past might be exactly the sort of strange, lore-deep Middle-earth story a lifelong Tolkien obsessive like Stephen Colbert can make work. And The Rings of Power, whatever you think of it, has put images on television at a scale almost nobody else would even attempt. There is craft in these things, there's talent. There may even be magic. That's not the problem. The problem is the direction of travel. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings began as an act of creative necessity. A filmmaker looked at something everyone said could not be done and decided, with the calm irrationality of a true fan, that actually it could. Not cheaply, easily, or safely, but properly. That's why the original trilogy still feels the way it does. Not perfect, no adaptation is, but purposeful. Every cut, every compression, every compromise is serving a clear shape. Get the ring to Mordor, pull the Fellowship apart, bring the scattered pieces back together for one final stand, then let the old world pass away. The films have momentum because the story has momentum, and when Jackson reached the end, he stopped. One of the hardest things in franchise storytelling is knowing when the story you set out to tell is finished. But Lord of the Rings ends, not just technically but emotionally. The ring is destroyed, the age changes, the ship leaves, the world moves on without the people who saved it. That's part of its power. It is a story about ending, which makes it slightly awkward when the modern entertainment industry has developed a near-religious terror of endings. Because endings are bad for business, endings do not renew, endings do not expand the subscriber base. But that doesn't mean everybody involved is cynical. Jackson is not some villainous franchise goblin sitting on a pile of Blu-rays muttering about synergy. Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens know the world intimately. Andy Serkis has earned his place in it. Colbert, of all people, clearly loves Tolkien with the sort of intensity that should probably be monitored, but is also deeply reassuring. The problem's not that nobody cares. The problem is caring now happens inside a machine that has different appetites. The artist asks, what shape does the story need? The machine asks, what else can this world provide? Those questions can overlap. Sometimes they produce wonderful things, but they are not the same question. Peter Jackson built Middle-earth for cinemas because he believed it could be done. The machine keeps returning because he was right. That's the complicated legacy. The triumph creates the appetite creates the franchise, and the franchise keeps walking back down the road looking for anything that has not yet been used. Because once a story becomes a world, and once a world becomes a business, there's no such thing as the end. Only the next chapter, even if the last chapter was the point. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. For more on this and plenty of other geeky things, head to geektown.co.uk. And if you haven't already, check out Geektown Radio, our weekly podcast covering the latest TV, film and gaming news. And if you're enjoying Geekstorians, leave a review wherever you listen. It really does help other people find the show. Thank you for listening. See you next time.